The night was alive with music and celebration, but for Aisha, it felt like a funeral march where every beat of the drum echoed her heart's desperate cry for freedom, because while the guests laughed and clapped, and her family smiled with pride, at the glittering ornaments decorating the mansion, she sat in a suffocating bridal gown that felt less like a dress and more like a prison, each jewel weighing down her spirit and each layer of fabric reminding her that her future was being sold to a man who did not love her, a man who saw her as a trophy to display, a contract to sign, a possession to own. And as she looked into the mirror, her own reflection seemed like a stranger, a broken doll painted in gold. And in that instant, she realized she could not let this be the end of her story, because she deserved more than to be locked away in a loveless cage. She deserved to choose, to live, to feel alive. And so, with trembling hands and a racing heart, she lifted her gown, pushed open the side door, and stepped into the dimly lit hallway, each step echoing like thunder in her ears. Because she knew discovery meant disaster. She knew her family would drag her back and force her into the chains of that marriage. But she also knew that if she stayed, she would lose herself forever. And so she moved quickly, her bangles clinking against her wrists, her breath ragged, her body driven not by strength, but by sheer will, until at last she reached the garden where the sweet scent of roses mocked her misery, and without looking back, she burst through the open gate into the wet, empty street, the cool air rushing against her face like a breath of hope. And though her veil tore against the thorny branches and her bare feet sank into mud, she kept running, whispering to herself that she had to make it. She had to escape. She had to live, but her legs trembled with exhaustion and her chest felt like fire. And just when she thought her body would give out, she saw the glow of headlights cutting through the rain, a black car racing toward her like a force of fate itself, and she raised her hand desperately, her whole body shaking as she stepped into the road, praying for mercy, for salvation, for a miracle. And the tires screeched, water splashed around her, and the car stopped just inches from her fragile figure, leaving her frozen in fear and hope as the tinted window rolled down, and she found herself staring into the piercing eyes of a man whose very presence made the storm seem quiet, a man whose gaze was so steady and commanding that she felt exposed, stripped of every lie, and yet in that gaze there was no cruelty, only curiosity, only power, only the kind of strength that could either destroy her or protect her. And though her voice trembled, she forced the words out, begging him to help her, to take her anywhere far from here, to save her from the nightmare chasing her. And he studied her with a silence that made her knees weak, his sharp jaw clenched, his expression unreadable, as though he was weighing the weight of her soul in that moment. And then, with a calm yet commanding tone, he unlocked the door and told her to get inside. And though fear told her she was insane to trust a stranger, her heart whispered that this man was different. This man could change everything. And so she climbed into the soft leather seat, her body still trembling, her tears mixing with the rain on her face, while the car surged forward into the night, leaving behind the glowing mansion and the life she had just abandoned. And as silence filled the space between them, broken only by the hum of the engine, she dared to glance at him again, at his tailored suit that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders, at the calm strength in his hands as they gripped the wheel, at the air of power that surrounded him like an aura. And she realized with a shock that this was no ordinary man. And when he finally spoke, his voice was deep, smooth, and edged with steel, asking her who she was running from. She told him everything. She told him about the forced marriage, about the man waiting at the altar, about the family who saw her as a deal to be made, about the way her heart screamed for freedom. And she expected him to laugh or judge her, but instead his eyes darkened, his jaw tightened, and when she finished, his words fell like a promise, steady and certain. when he said that she was safe now, that no one would touch her while she was with him. And in that moment, as she stared at him, at the man who had appeared in her life like fate itself, she realized she had not just stopped any car. She had stopped his car, and his name, Adrian Blackwood, would soon mean everything to her, because he was not just a stranger, not just a man with piercing eyes and an untouchable aura. He was a CEO, a billionaire, a man who could give her the freedom she craved, a man who could change her destiny forever. The rain still poured outside as the car sped through the wide streets, the city glowing like a galaxy beyond the glass. And Aisha sat in silence, her heart still racing from the escape, her eyes stealing glances at the man who now held her future in his hands, because there was something about Adrian Blackwood that made her feel both safe and terrified at the same time, as though he was a storm she could not outrun, yet a shelter she could not live without. And while the world outside blurred past in silver streaks, she whispered a thank you, her voice trembling, her words almost lost in the hum of the engine, but he heard her, his eyes flicking toward her for the briefest second, his expression unreadable. Before he returned his gaze to the road, his presence filling the car with a silence that was not empty but heavy, heavy with unspoken truths and questions waiting in the shadows. And when the car finally slowed, she looked out to see a towering building of glass and steel rising into the night sky, its lights glowing like a beacon, its gates opening without hesitation at the sight of his vehicle. And she realized she was entering a world she had never known. A world of wealth, of power, of influence, the very world she had once been forced into but from the outside, with chains and demands. And now she was being brought into it on her own terms, by a man who carried that world on his shoulders. And as the car descended into the private garage, her breath caught in her throat, because every detail spoke of perfection and control, from the polished floors to the silent guards who bowed their heads in respect. And when he stepped out of the car, his presence seemed larger than life, his tailored suit unwrinkled even after the storm, his aura commanding yet quiet. And when he opened her door and held out his hand, she hesitated only for a moment before taking it, his touch firm, his palm warm. And in that simple contact, she felt a promise, a strange reassurance that she could not explain, as though fate itself had decided she was safe here. And he guided her into the elevator, the walls of glass reflecting their figures, her torn veil, his sharp eyes, her trembling frame, his steady posture, two strangers bound by one night and one choice. And as the elevator rose higher and higher, she dared to look at him again, at the strength in his jaw, the calm in his eyes, the authority in every breath he took. And she wondered why a man like him had stopped for her, why he had chosen to help her, why he had not simply driven past and left her to the storm. But she could not ask, not yet, so she held her silence. And when the doors opened, she stepped into a penthouse that stole her breath away, its walls lined with floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretching out beneath like a sea of stars, the rain falling like diamonds against the glass, the furniture elegant and understated, yet impossibly expensive. And she stood frozen, her bare feet sinking into soft carpets, her hands clutching her gown, because she had never been in a place like this, never dreamed she could belong anywhere like this. And he watched her quietly, his eyes studying her, his face giving away nothing. Before he walked to a cabinet and returned with a blanket, draping it gently over her shoulders, the gesture so unexpected that her chest tightened, her eyes burned, because no one had done something so simple for her in years. No one had cared if she was cold or scared or tired, and when he told her to sit, his voice calm but firm, she obeyed, her body sinking into the soft couch, her hands gripping the edges as though the world might vanish at any moment, and he disappeared for a while before returning with food, warm and fragrant, dishes that smelled like comfort itself. And when she hesitated, he told her to eat, and she did, slowly, cautiously, each bite melting on her tongue. And before she could stop herself, tears slipped down her cheeks again, and when he asked if something was wrong with the food, she shook her head quickly, telling him the food was perfect, that she simply was not used to kindness. And for the first time, his gaze softened, his lips almost curving into something like a smile, though it disappeared quickly, replaced once again by the steel mask of a man who had built an empire on control. And yet she felt it, that flicker of something human, something tender hidden deep beneath. And as the night stretched on, she found herself asking him why he had helped her, why he had cared when she was just a stranger who had stopped his car in the middle of the road. And he looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice lower, rougher, telling her that he knew what it felt like to be trapped, that he knew what it meant to have no choice. And though he offered no details, though his eyes gave away nothing, she understood that behind his wealth and his power, there were shadows, scars carved by his own battles, and she felt a connection spark between them, fragile yet real, like two broken pieces finding an edge that fit. And when he told her she would sleep here tonight, that she was safe, that no one would touch her as long as she was under his roof, her heart swelled with relief so strong it felt like it might break her, and he led her to a room softer than anything she had ever seen. A bed that looked like a cloud, walls lined with soft light, air that smelled of calm and safety, and she turned to him, whispering her thanks once again, her voice cracking. And he nodded, telling her the door was hers to close. And when she closed it, when she leaned against the wood and let out a long, trembling breath, she felt for the first time in years that she was not a prisoner, not a pawn, not a burden, but a woman standing on the edge of a new story. And as she tore away the heavy jewelry, piece by piece, letting the bangles fall to the floor, letting the necklace drop from her neck, pulling the torn veil from her hair, she felt her soul shedding chains, she felt her body straighten, she felt her heart breathe, and when she crawled into the bed, soft blankets wrapping around her, her eyes closing with exhaustion, her last thought before sleep took her was that she had escaped not just a marriage but a life of misery, and she had stepped into the unknown with a man who was more than he appeared, a man who had saved her without knowing that in saving her he had also changed his own fate. And as she drifted into dreams, he stood by the window in his office, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand, staring out at the storm with a restless mind, thinking of her eyes, of her voice, of the way she had looked when she begged for freedom. And though he told himself she was nothing, just a stranger, he knew deep down that she was not nothing. She was the beginning of something he could not yet name. Something that would test his strength, something that would shatter his walls, something that would change both of their lives forever. The morning light touched the city with gold, and Aisha opened her eyes slowly, her body sinking deeper into the soft bed as though she had been lifted from a nightmare into a dream. And for a moment, she did not remember where she was until she saw the tall windows, the endless skyline beyond them, and the quiet elegance of the room. And then it came rushing back to her, the escape, the storm, the car, the man whose presence had wrapped around her like both danger and safety, and her heart fluttered with fear and hope at the same time, because though she was free from the wedding, she was now bound to a fate she could not understand, tied to a stranger who was not really a stranger, a man the world called untouchable, Adrian Blackwood, and she rose from the bed, her gown heavy and ruined, her hair tangled, her eyes still swollen from tears. Yet in that moment, she felt lighter than she had in years, because for once she had chosen her own path. And when she stepped into the living room, she found him there, standing tall by the glass, his back to her, the city glowing at his feet like an empire, his suit already perfect, his presence so commanding that it seemed the entire world waited for his next move. And when he turned, his eyes met hers with the same steady intensity as the night before. And though his face was calm, she felt the weight of a storm hidden beneath his control. And he asked her if she had slept, his voice deep and smooth. And she nodded, whispering that she had, and for a moment silence stretched between them. But it was not awkward. It was heavy. It was alive, as though both of them were waiting for something neither dared to speak. And then he told her he had made arrangements, that her family was already searching for her, that they would not find her, that he would make sure she was safe, and she stared at him, unable to understand why a man like him would care. Why he would risk anything for a runaway bride he had, met only hours ago, and when she asked him why, his eyes darkened, his jaw tightened, and he told her quietly that he hated cages, that he hated chains, that no one deserved to live as a prisoner. And in that moment, she realized that beneath the layers of his power, beneath the reputation of the ruthless billionaire, there was a man who had known pain, who had known what it meant to be trapped. And though he gave no details, she felt the truth in his voice. And her heart ached for him, because he was not just a savior, he was broken too. And as the days passed, she stayed hidden in his world, the penthouse her shelter, the storm outside unable to touch her. And with every passing moment she found herself drawn to him more and more, to the way he carried himself with unshakable control, to the way he spoke with strength and calm, to the way his eyes softened only when they rested on her. And she tried to remind herself that she was nothing to him, just a girl he had saved. But her heart refused to believe it because she felt the change in the air when he was near. She felt the heat in his gaze when he thought she was not looking. She felt the way his walls cracked when she smiled. And one evening, when she stood by the window staring at the city lights, he joined her, his presence close, his voice low, asking her what she dreamed of. And she told him she dreamed of freedom, of love, of a life where she could breathe. And when she asked him the same, his eyes grew distant, and he told her he dreamed of peace, of silence, of someone who saw him not for his power, but for his soul. And their eyes met, and something passed between them, something unspoken yet undeniable. And she knew then that her life had not just been saved, it had been rewritten, because fate had not led her into his car by accident. Fate had carried her to the one man who could love her as fiercely as he could protect her. And though the world outside still searched for her, though her family still demanded her return, Adrian Blackwood stood as a wall between her and the darkness, a wall unbreakable, a shield unshakable. And in his arms she found not only safety but belonging. And when at last he confessed that he did not want her to leave, that he wanted her to stay, that he wanted her to be his, not as property, but as his equal, as his partner, as the woman who had walked into his life and melted his frozen heart, she felt her own walls fall, her own fear vanish, because she had never known love like this, love that did not cage her but set her free. And when he kissed her, the world outside disappeared. The storm of her past silenced forever, and the future opened wide before them. A future where she was not a bride sold to chains, but a woman cherished by a man who had everything yet found, his everything in her. And so the runaway bride who had stopped a random car on a stormy night became the queen of a billionaire's world, not by force, not by fear, but by a love written in destiny. A love that changed both of their lives forever.